video games. The reason this generation of Americans is the best ever.
The debate surrounding the relationship between video games and aggressive behaviors, or even violence, is decades old. But over the many years during which the conversation has drifted in and out of the zeitgeist to greater or lesser degrees, the exact nature of that debate has changed significantly. In the early 2000s, the crisis was that games were causing a violence epidemic in the youth, and if there was a singular face for the claims that gameplay caused violence, it was almost assuredly Jack Thompson, a since-disbarred attorney who made a plethora of outrageous statements regarding games, describing them as murder simulators directly responsible for multiple tragedies, including Columbine and Virginia Tech, for which he repeatedly sought legal action, largely against Grand Theft Auto developer Rockstar Games. Gamers both contested and mocked Thompson's wild claims as ludicrous, and a manifestation of the same misplaced concern from older generations that were not familiar with the medium, a misplaced concern that created a similar moral panic surrounding Dungeons & Dragons in the 1990s, or comic books as far back as the 1950s. Thompson's repeated abuse of the legal system while on his crusade against video games eventually led to his disbarment in 2008. While many may have forgotten, or perhaps were not even born during the height of the 2000s anti-violent video game movement that was such a prominent feature of neocon politics at the time, far more can probably recall the now infamous series of events broadly known as GamerGate, which largely began in 2014 concerning the issues of ethics in games journalism.
Video game journalism?
Of course, if one were to peruse the Wikipedia article regarding the topic, it is described as a hate campaign orchestrated by sexist, racist, bigoted gamers to attack women and minorities in gaming, and while over time the entire debacle devolved into an exceptionally cringe social movement, initially it really was about ethics in games journalism. Long before I even started this channel, and despite not being personally involved, I wrote a piece about the topic for an undergraduate college class even. It seems that none of us even tertiarily related to GamerGate can ever truly escape the phenomenon.
Someone once told me time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again.
The journalistic articles written about GamerGate between 2014 and 2016 blamed it for everything from harassment and bullying to the election of Donald Trump to serving as some kind of pipeline into far-right neo-Nazi ideologies, but they never really stopped being published in the decades since it began, but rather just kind of decreased in frequency. However, in 2024, something somewhat novel changed the game, pun intended, and that was the revelation that a small Montreal-based narrative design contractor had worked on some major and often majorly divisive games over the past few years. The company in question, Sweet Baby Incorporated, was criticized for their perceived inclusion of woke politics in said games, such as Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, and God of War Ragnarok. SBI further came under fire after some statements from their co-founder and CEO Kim Belair resurfaced. Belair stated that gaming companies needed to, essentially, be terrified into hiring her company to push progressive messaging in their games.
Put this stuff up to your higher-ups, and if they don't see the value in what you're asking for when you ask for consultants, when you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibility of what's going to happen if they don't give you what you want.
And described gamers as picky babies who must be spoon-fed left-wing politics that she knows they dislike via gaming narratives.
And the problem is that we don't just cater to them like, here's something that we think you'll enjoy. We cater to them the way that we cater to like a picky baby. We feed them the same thing that we know that they love, and we keep on feeding it. We're like, here you go, you love it, eat this, eat this, eat this, so that then when they get anything else, they react as a picky baby would, which is be like, oh no, thank you, I do not want this. And we've actually done this so long that what we're doing is creating an entire nation of picky babies, and they make us scared to deviate from what we actually want to do, just in case these picky babies don't want to play our games.
She even described herself as woke, stating, quote, "None of what we're doing here is about ticking boxes or about a veneer of wokeness. We actually have to care about making that stuff." Gamers obviously finding this contemptible and seeing it as evidence of everything that so many had been complaining about for the previous decade, occasionally causing minor controversies compared to the scale of GamerGate, such as the Starfield pronoun debacle.
Sorry, did you want to get immersed in our world? Yeah, well, guess what? Pronouns! Gender ambiguity! Current day Californian! Because that's all we know! Because we're boring! We're so boring!
Quickly identified the same old problems, and the investigations into Sweet Baby's involvement in various games earned the moniker of GamerGate 2. A Steam curator page titled Sweet Baby Inc. Detected gained hundreds of thousands of followers by doing nothing more than just listing the games that the company had worked on as a sort of warning for gamers to potentially avoid purchasing them. Almost immediately, Sweet Baby employees, namely Chris Kindred and Felix Kramer, the latter being an alumni from the original GamerGate, came out of the woodwork to demand the page, which again did nothing more than list the games that they had once proudly shown off on their own company website as having worked on, be taken down, and the curator banned from Steam, losing access to his entire game library. Writers at Kotaku, including Alyssa Mercante, were quick to run defense for SBI, saying they don't force diversity into games, despite that being a key part of their stated mission, per SBI CEO Kim Belair.
I'm the co-founder of a little narrative development company called Sweet Baby Inc. We do narrative development in games and kind of beyond, and we try to bring a lot of inclusion, diversity, and new ideas kind of to the industry.
This, of course, all only produced psychological reactants, the Streisand effect, only bringing Sweet Baby under tighter scrutiny from the public, growing increasingly curious as to the firm's exact involvement in various games. Since piquing public curiosity, a plethora of mainstream games journalists, which is really more of a slur than a job title, came out to support Sweet Baby while denigrating the stream curator, the hundreds of thousands of people who followed it, and more broadly, anyone even slightly critical of Sweet Baby and their involvement with the aforementioned games, which only further fanned the flames and likely, inadvertently from their limited perspective, only gave further credence to the notion that the gaming press was in bed with the games industry, which both figuratively and literally was the exact issue that sparked the original GamerGate, no matter what you read on Wikipedia.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Things quickly escalated as people began to dig into Sweet Baby Inc. to find that it was largely staffed by former Ubisoft employees, and that Ubisoft had been given a grant from the Quebec government of up to $25,000 a year per employee. As of 2021, tax credits for multimedia companies had cost the Quebecois people 253 million Canadian dollars. While a similar plan had been proposed for Montreal, where Sweet Baby is located, as of yet, their employees have not seen any investments, at least from that province. Ottawa also decided to dump a huge amount of money into the supposed issue, namely 300,000 Canadian dollars, for the purpose of studying the potential links between games and violent extremism within days of the Sweet Baby controversy breaking. In seeming lockstep, in the same week that Ottawa committed all of that money to investigate toxic gamers, a US-based 501c3 nonprofit organization, Take This, injected themselves into the debate with a public statement describing the backlash as a harassment campaign and called for, quote, players and the industry at large to clearly and unequivocally denounce GamerGate. Oh please, you don't want to know what happens when gamers actually target people. Take This described itself as a mental health organization providing comprehensive resources, support, and consultation tailored for the unique needs of the game development community, and whose work is funded in part by a grant from the Department of Homeland Security, which in 2022 set aside nearly $700,000 to study radicalization in gaming. Less surprisingly than all of the direct government involvement, the ADL also made a statement, appealing to Congress to regulate online games against hate and extremism. Somewhat amusingly, BBC gaming presenter Jules Hardy, representing the same position as all of the aforementioned journalists, activists, and government agencies all collectively calling gamers violent extremists, even went so far as to demand that there be a, quote, final purge of gamers who don't like the kind of changes that companies like SBI enforce, to make games political, not entertaining. So, after a decade of debate and the denigration of gamers as being not just picky babies who need to be force-fed messaging in place of fun, but as serial harassers and even a dangerous hate group of potential terrorists, I think it's time to really deeply dig into the data on the relationship between games and aggression to finally answer the question, Are gamers toxic? If so, are video games the reason for that toxicity, which thereby could be ameliorated by replacing violence with deaf black girl graffiti simulators? To really understand the current state of the discussion of male gamer toxicity, more than 10 years after GamerGate, we first need to go back even further, back to when the concern with video games causing harm to society came predominantly from the Christian right, not from the woke left. So let's begin by examining the history of the moral combat. And yes, I stole that cringy title from a book. But the moral combat that has concerned video games for over a quarter of a century now, of pixels and politics. The academic portion of the discussion regarding the association between video game play, actual violence, aggressive behavior, or even extremism had already been going on for a long time by the mid-2000s, with parents and politicians seeing the growing industry as one of growing concern.
I was gonna build like a farm here, and you build Auschwitz!
In 2005, the American Psychological Association, drawing largely from the work of Dr. Craig Anderson and his cohort of scholars, a name you will come to know very well over the course of this video, dear viewer, released what they described as a comprehensive report in which they claimed that exposure to violent video games A. increases aggressive behavior, B. increases aggressive thoughts, C. increases angry feelings, D. decreases helpful behavior, and E. increases physiological arousal. Anderson and his colleagues made a request for a number of resolutions to mitigate these effects, that they were reporting as, essentially, settled science. The APA resolved itself in this report to thereby dedicate its resources to reducing violence in video games marketed to youth, to advocate for greater funding for research regarding sexism and the role of minorities in games, engage with developers to address the issue of violence in games, to recommend that the entertainment industry depict negative consequences for depictions of violence, and to aid in the development of a rating system that accurately reflected the content of games, which, despite the failure to establish a government-operated body via the Video Games Rating Act of 1994, was still already well underway through the ESRB. But what was it that the American Psychological Association, an ironic name for a group that no one wants to associate with, was seeing in the academic literature that so convinced them that games were dangerous, particularly to young people? Let's look at the early data and the long history of the moral panic surrounding video games, which, while very different 20 years later, now concerning representation and diversity more than violence, we can see has had those through threads since the mid-2000s. And 20 years later are still coming up with the same conclusions, that games have negative effects on people and thereby need be changed, regulated, and controlled by those in positions of authority and power who simply know better than gamers or even the companies that make video games. Much of the early literature on the subject was reliant upon the General Aggression Model Theory, or GAM. And yes, the irony that the acronym is one letter off from game is not lost on me, but which posits that interacting with violent media causes viewers, or in this case players, to form aggressive mental schemas or frameworks. These schemas then, theoretically, should serve as a shorthand that informs those exposed to the media as to how they should behave in various social situations. Under this theory, exposure to, say, Grand Theft Auto would create a perception in the player that it is appropriate to engage violently with the police during a traffic stop, for example. There's a pretty basic issue with the GAM, though, prima facie, that I'm sure a lot of you have already picked up on. If it were the case that exposure to violent games was associated with the development of cognitive models that promote aggressive or violent behaviors, then we would expect to see the rates of violent crime having increased dramatically since the explosion of video games in popularity. After all, a 2017 Pew report illustrated that 72% of young American men under the age of 30 sometimes or often play video games. And yet, violent crime rates in the United States have fallen drastically since 1991, according to Statista data. And that trend was already very apparent by 2005 when the APA released their report. If the general aggression model had any veracity, then on its face we would expect violent crime to increase as the ubiquity of video games has increased. And yet, it has not. I mean, if violent video games make people violent, then Smash players should be good at fighting instead of being good at ending up on the sex offenders register, right? So why did the APA conclude that games were dangerous anyway? Perhaps the most important post-APA report discussions regarding the subject matter that dissented from the common beliefs that games were related to violence originated from the research program of Dr. Christopher Ferguson, beginning with 2 meta-analyses that he sole-authored in 2007. Because Dr. Ferguson was one of the first scholars to really challenge the contentions of the game and pop culture notions at the time regarding games and aggression. While I know it might be easy to dismiss a lot of what I'm about to talk about here, and for a prolonged amount of time at that, due to just the age of these studies, the back and forth between scholars that I'm going to describe in detail that ensued here set the stage not just for GamerGate 1.0, but I would contend the entire discussion of the effects of video games in the preceding decade and a half. So just hang with me as we go over the data. In the first of the 2 papers published by Dr. Ferguson in 2007, Evidence for Publication Bias in Video Game Violence Effects Literature, Ferguson reviewed the findings of research published in peer-reviewed academic journals between 1995 and 2005, which included a measure of aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, pro-social behavior, or a form of physiological arousal, such as heart rate. A total of 25 papers that met these criteria were identified, 14 of which included experimental methods, and 13 of which included non-experimental methods. While there was little evidence for publication bias, which is indicated by general agreement between the instruments used to measure it for aggressive thoughts specifically, that was not the case for aggressive behaviors, which were measured in totally inconsistent ways and with very small effect sizes, such that if only 6 unpublished papers were to have found even slightly different results, the significance of any relationship between gameplay and aggressive behaviors would have become trivial. This tendency was the case for both experimental and non-experimental studies. Ferguson noted that the lack of standardization in measurement of aggressive behaviors allowed scholars to engage in a little bit of data fishing.
Not fishing.
But then how come this hook's in my head, fool?
It's nothing to do with me, sir.
It's attached to your rod, mother liquor.
Manipulating their findings until they reached something significant, which obviously is not the way that researchers are supposed to go about these things. At the same time, another behavior that researchers are not supposed to engage in is presenting any potential physical or psychological harm to human participants. And as such, it makes sense why aggressive behaviors are really difficult to measure and are often unstandardized. That is, it would be unethical to introduce a stimuli, in this case a violent video game, and then prompt the player to enact some real-world aggressive behavior against another real person. That ethical concern is likely why many of you have heard of the infamous Milgram obedience experiments, wherein subjects believed that they were giving electric shocks, including deadly levels of shock, to another human being, and which decades later participants reported being permanently psychologically disturbed by having believed, even just for a moment, that they had murdered someone at the behest of a scientist in a lab coat asking them to please continue the experiment. So how does one get around the ethical issues of Milgram while still measuring something that would serve as an analog for actual aggressive behavior? As mentioned, and as we're going to see a lot more of going forward, the game studies literature is all over the place in operationalization and often included measures that didn't seem to be accurately measuring aggressive acts. Examples of survey items used by video game researchers to assess aggression identified in Markey and Ferguson's 2017 book, Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong include, I tell my friends openly when I disagree with them. To say nasty things about a person behind his or her back is okay. When people annoy me, I may tell them what I think of them. I am suspicious of overly friendly strangers. Children should be spanked for temper tantrums. Our country has the right to protect its borders forcefully. I feel unsociable. Any nation should be ready with a strong military at all times. War in self-defense is perfectly all right. I feel willful. To spread rumors about others is totally okay. To show someone up in front of others is totally okay. War is often necessary. The person running the study was not very courteous. And of course, this.
You wanna come to a club where people wear on each other?
Yeah, those don't exactly sound like indicators of aggression to me. But a common method, if not the most common method of measuring aggressive behaviors, is using something more akin to the Milgram experiment, except rather than administering electric shocks, participants believed that they were playing an annoying noise in the ear of another person with varying decibel levels.
What you listening to, son?
I don't think you like it.
Well, why not? I like this new generation of music. But
is that really aggression either? Anderson and Dill used such a method in their 2000 publication and found significant effects in only one of their 4 tests, and even in that case, the confidence interval crossed 0, making their one supposedly positive finding not even evidence of their claim. In contrast, Ferguson et al. 2008, using a standardized version of the noise blast instrument, found no relationship between gameplay and aggressive behavior via that measure. Of 40 measurements that Ferguson 2007A assessed, only 15, or 38%, provided evidence for the reliability of their measures in the study. Moreover, Ferguson found that the lack of standardization had become worse over time, with more recent studies decreasing in the use of standardized measures. As a result, even in this early meta-analysis, published in the same year that saw the release of huge titles including Mass Effect and Team Fortress 2, it was clear that there was a problem with how scholars were associating violent behavior with gameplay. It's important to reiterate that there was both standardization and significant results for aggressive thoughts, and this is logical because gameplay inherently induces arousal. That's part of what makes games fun, in the same way that a tense moment in a film makes movies fun, in a process known as excitation transfer. Would you want to watch a movie with no stakes, no conflict, no tension? Probably not, judging from the success of films like Madame Web. The basic structure of the hero's journey in storytelling requires the characters undergo trials and failure in order for any subsequent success to be meaningful. Even games without a proper fail state, such as visual novels, still have stakes in the way that films do via character or story-based drama, mystery, etc. As such, games produce increased arousal, and arousal can be related to aggressive thoughts, but even at this first step of analysis, the evidence was pointing in the direction that there was a major problem with identifying any relationship between games and aggressive behaviors. Sure, watching John Wick or Top Gun is going to get your blood pumping and may evoke some aggressive thoughts. But having aggressive thoughts does not mean one will go out and engage in aggressive acts.
Now is the time to feel the love of the gods. A deep love. A great love.
A love powerful and formidable. A love that crushes.
I get it.
Like a mace. La 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 la.
To be fair, it is understandable why scholars were trying to find an answer in video games to explain tragic events like Columbine. But the problem that Ferguson identified here was that it seemed that scholars were more interested in evidencing their a priori beliefs about video games, likely influenced by the baseless claims from activists like Jack Thompson, rather than actually searching for the truth. Ultimately, they were looking for a scapegoat, not an answer. Ferguson's second paper, published in 2007, titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a meta-analytic review of positive and negative effects of violent video games, looked deeper into the issue. This meta-analysis concerned 17 peer-reviewed journal papers published between 1995 and 2007 that specifically included a measure of aggression, visuospatial cognition, and differentiated between violent and non-violent video games used as stimuli. Visuospatial cognition refers to processing of and interaction with objects related to problem-solving and orientation within a space, real or virtual. Ferguson found that the effects of violent video game play on visuospatial cognition was 10 times that of the effect of gameplay on measures of aggression. Keeping in mind the issues of publication bias and non-standardization measurement of aggression in the literature, playing violent video games accounted for 13% of the variance in increased visuospatial processing. Ferguson's analysis did not support the hypothesis that games were significantly associated with aggression, indicating that there was, in fact, a relatively positive effect of playing violent video games. That being that games may aid players in becoming more adept at problem-solving and spatial reasoning, not that games induced violent behavior. Going back to a study I briefly mentioned earlier, Ferguson et al. 2008, we can look at some specific experimental data in more detail instead of just meta-analyses alone. Rather than work from the perspective of the game, Ferguson et al. Apply the catalyst model of violent crime, in which propensity towards violence is predicted by genetic factors, family and upbringing factors, aggressive personality, and a motivation towards violence in a given instance. In this model, media exposure acts only as a catalyst, not a predictor. That is, if someone has a genetic predisposition towards aggressive behavior, had a disturbed childhood or family life, has an aggressive personality and a reason to behave violently, then playing a violent video game or being exposed to violent media may contribute to that person engaging in an act of aggression. However, the media is merely a catalyst and is not responsible for the aggressive act comparatively to the other predictive factors. In their first study, undergraduate students were assigned to one of three conditions. One group played a violent game, Medal of Honor Allied Assault, the second a non-violent game, Myst 3, and the third read descriptions of the two games and were asked to choose which of the two they would rather play. Seriously? Myst 3? Well, that's certainly one way to drive someone to violence. Respondents were also asked if they played violent video games regularly in their personal lives. After playing for 45 minutes, participants were asked how fun, exciting, and/or frustrating they found the game to be, asked if they had played the game before, and if they would like to continue playing it outside of the study environment. Next, trait aggression and preference for violent video games was assessed, and then participants played a reaction time game against a fictional opponent, wherein they could select the decibel level of a white noise sound to play as a punishment for their alleged competitor. Again, this is the noise blast test. The decibel levels ranged from 0 to 95, with 125 serving as the threshold for painful exposure in humans, letting the participant know that the sound would not be painful, but rather just annoying. Like this.
Dude, I warned you. I said I was going to do that if you did that again.
We could again argue about whether or not this stimuli actually constitutes as a good substitute for aggressive behavior, but as I've explained, it's kind of what we have to work with. Participants rated Medal of Honor as more exciting and Myst as more frustrating. Gee, what a shock. Trait aggression and previous exposure to either game did not influence reported desire to continue playing the game in their free time. Only gender was related to game preference, with women preferring to play Myst and men preferring Medal of Honor. Understandable, as one is a fast-paced first-person shooter set in World War II, and the other's audio sounds like it was recorded at the bottom of a K-hole. Similarly, while men tended to be more aggressive in terms of noise decibel level, there was no effect of game type on increased aggressive behavior. That is, subjects who played Medal of Honor for 45 minutes were not more likely to play a louder, more annoying noise as punishment than were those who played Myst for 45 minutes. Astonishingly, on behalf of the Myst players. Additionally, there was no effect of past exposure to violent video games nor of trait aggression on actual aggressive behaviors in this laboratory experiment. As such, this experiment provided no support for the GAM hypothesis. In a second experiment, undergraduate students were surveyed on their trait aggression, previous violent video game exposure, history of familial violence, including physical abuse, witnessing, DV, use of spanking, verbal abuse, and the degree to which one felt loved by their parents, as well as a history of self-reported violent behavior, including acts such as hitting a parent or caregiver, or attacking someone on purpose, both over the course of the respondent's life and over the last 12 months. Yeah, that's a pretty heavy questionnaire for a study about video games. At the most basic correlational level, prior exposure to violent video games was related to trait aggression. However, violent game exposure was unrelated to violent behavior. A regression analysis, which allows us to determine how much variables predict one another, revealed that male gender, physical abuse, and verbal abuse predicted higher levels of trait aggression. However, spanking, witnessing DV, and perceptions of parental love did not predict this trait. Male gender was the strongest predictor, while prior video game exposure did not contribute to the model fit, which in total explained 18% of variance in trait aggression. That is then, males and, to a lesser degree, people of either sex who were exposed to physical or verbal abuse within the home are more likely to be aggressive, and more aggressive people are more likely to play violent video games, not the other way around. Games don't seem then, according to these two experiments, make people more aggressive, but rather, more aggressive people may be more likely to be drawn towards violent games. Weird that people with a lot of stress in their lives might want some catharsis by playing an intense video game, right?
Boobs, titties even, honkers, if you would. Inordinate debauchery, one vice of many.
Concerning actual violent behavior, male gender, exposure to physical abuse, trait aggression, and perceptions of parental affection were all predictors. And while violent gameplay was also a predictor, it was only so via interaction with trait aggression. To reiterate, because people who are more aggressive tend to be more likely to play violent video games, it is trait aggression that actually predicts the violent behavior, not a preference for violent video games in isolate. Video game exposure additionally only had any influence on participants within the upper quartile of trait aggression, indicating that it is only the most aggressive people who are drawn towards violent games as a product of trait aggression, and then actually go on to enact physical violence. Violent video games then, according to these data, are in no way responsible for trait aggression that may lead to violent crime. They are simply something that more aggressive people may be more likely to play rather than non-violent games. They are a symptom, not the disease. It would seem then that preventing or attempting to prevent familial, physical, and verbal abuse is a far more real and serious issue than violent video games.
Oh, it's a rum. Rum drinkers beat their wife.
An additional meta-analysis from Ferguson and Kilburn, 2009, reviewed 25 articles published in academic journals between 1998 and 2008, and included measures of aggressive or violent behaviors, which further contributes to the wealth of information Ferguson and his colleagues added to this area of study. But before I get into what they found, I want to point out why, in their own words, these scholars were so adamant about not only evidencing publication bias by only reviewing published papers, but also because they were specifically concerned about the use of unpublished data by ideologically driven actors to prove a point rather than to find the truth, stating, quote, "Earlier reviews have found attempting to include non-published studies is highly problematic, because parties with a vested ideological interest in the outcome may select which studies to send along, and such data has not been peer-reviewed," end quote. I bring this up now because it is this exact point of contention that's going to become rather relevant later. Of the 25 studies assessed, 11 used well-validated measures that assessed physically or verbally aggressive behaviors, data regarding violent crime, or clinical skills demonstrably related to real-world physical aggression or violence. The rest used poorly validated measures of real-world behavior, including unstandardized instruments that lacked reliability or validity data, or lacked generalizability. In total, 10 studies, 37% used proxy measures of aggression, such as Ferguson's own research using the noise blast test. 14 studies, or 52%, used non-standardized measures of aggression, including physical assaults, fighting, or arguing, and only 3 studies, or 11%, examined actual violent criminal behavior. They found that only experimental tests, using proxy measures such as the noise blast test, did not experience publication biasing. 7 studies appeared to have publication biases, and 9 reported inconsistent results. The uncorrected figure, not adjusting for publication bias, that Ferguson and Kilburn arrived at was 0.14, which is quite small. However, when accounting for publication bias, the corrected effect size was 0.08, which generally falls below the standard even for the smallest clinical effect sizes for meta-analysis. Unstandardized effects were larger than standardized ones, unreliable measures produced larger effect sizes than did reliable ones, and proxy measures produced larger effect sizes than did measures of actual aggressive or violent behavior. To put these estimates all into some perspective, Ferguson and Kilburn explain, quote, "For the most liberal estimates available, the effects seen for smoking and lung cancer are at least 8 times stronger than for media violence exposure. By using the more conservative figures for smoking and lung cancer for media violence exposure, that number is closer to 135 times stronger," end quote. As such, while there is a relationship between aggression and violent behavior with playing violent video games, the effect size is so small as to be almost entirely negligible. So it doesn't really seem, at least from the work that Ferguson and Kilburn were doing directly after the APA's report and its definitive conclusions about the dangers of video games, that there really was any robust evidence that games were causing harm. But not everyone agreed with Ferguson. In fact, a lot of scholars did not, as we will come to see. And I do not believe that said disagreement was based on genuine scientific interest, but instead on politics and feelings, not on facts. And thus, having laid the groundwork, let's get into what I like to call the Great Game Studies academic rap battle of 2010, or what Ferguson himself refers to it as, the Science Wars. Amongst these various meta-analyses and independent bits of research, one group of scholars who had been repeatedly cited and critiqued in Ferguson's work, specifically for their use of file drawer data, unpublished research, conference papers, book chapters, and dissertations, had finally had enough of actual scientific investigation into games and violence, and decided to strike back with their own meta-analysis in Anderson et al., 2010. In addition to complaining that Ferguson relied only on published and peer-reviewed journals, they took umbrage with the relatively small number of papers used, the exclusion of papers published before 1995, the comparison of experimental with longitudinal and non-experimental research, and the reuse of previously assessed studies in subsequent analyses. Thus, in an attempt to disprove the findings of Ferguson and his cohort, they conducted their own meta, drawing from 136 articles, including non-peer-reviewed data, which they insisted is a normal practice in such analyses. And while, yes, it may be a normal practice, it is not what we would call a best one. Anderson et al.'s meta assessed various outcome variables, including aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, aggressive feelings, prosocial behavior, physiological arousal, such as heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductive response, and culture of origin. They included experimental, cross-sectional, and longitudinal studies, and reported effect sizes of 0.21 for experimental studies, 0.262 for raw cross-sectional studies, 0.171 for partial cross-sectional analysis, and 0.203 for raw, and 0.075 for partial longitudinal analyses, all of which falls far above the 0.08 conclusion of Ferguson and Kilburn. They found these trends to be similar across cultures and illustrated a consistent positive relationship between violent video game exposure and aggressive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, as well as increased physiological arousal. In contrast, they reported video game violence was related to decreased prosociality, sensitivity, and empathy. Interestingly, Anderson et al. Admit that their results were going to be contested, probably because they already knew before they even published this that there was no way they could just throw this out there and not expect Ferguson to respond. Similarly, they admit to having used research that they probably should not have in prior work and committed themselves to fixing their past mistakes, while, as we'll see, committing the exact same errors here. Anderson et al. Conclude their paper by revealing their real reason, I believe, for conducting this meta-analysis in response to Ferguson's cohort in the first place: politics. Stating, quote, "We believe that debates can and should finally move beyond the simple question of whether violent video game play is a causal risk factor for aggressive behavior. The scientific literature has effectively and clearly shown the answer to be yes. Instead, we believe the public policy debate should move to questions concerning how to best deal with this risk factor," end quote. And there you have it. That's why, from my perspective, that this paper exists in the first place. To provide evidence to influence policy first and foremost, if not entirely. Nothing really says hubris like announcing that you've already won the debate and laying down your list of demands and edicts. Ferguson and Kilburn's response was academically brutal.
This is an exorcism.
They're very little different.
First, they point out that Anderson et al. Seem strangely fixated only on Ferguson's analysis rather than other contemporary analyses that similarly did not evidence a robust relationship, or any relationship, between gameplay and violence or aggression. In fact, Anderson et al. Cite Sherry 2001 as being supportive of their position when that report did not find evidence for a causal relationship between games and violence. Moreover, Sherry 2007, also cited by Anderson et al., asked the question in that report, quote, "Why do some scholars, for example, Gentile and Anderson 2003, continue to argue that video games are dangerous despite evidence to the contrary?"
Oh my god, stop lying.
Next, Ferguson and Kilburn criticize Anderson et al.'s contention that the use of unpublished data in meta-analysis is normal, when numerous scholars outside of the Ferguson cohort agree that best practices should focus on, if not exclusively use, peer-reviewed reports, as the inclusion of unpublished data may muddy the waters, resulting in what's known as garbage in, garbage out. That is, a meta-analysis can only ever be as good as the studies that comprise it.
I'm the trash man. I come out, I throw trash all over the ring.
Anderson et al. State in their report that they collected the unpublished studies they reviewed via, quote, "thorough, systematic, unbiased, transparent, and clearly documented methods," yet do not actually document how that was conducted. One of the most obvious ways, however, to access unpublished studies, if one believes that unpublished work should be included in a meta-analysis, is to contact other scholars whose work is in the same area of research, yet seemingly Anderson et al. Neglected to do so. Or at least, despite being in correspondence with Ferguson and Kilburn before the publication of their 2010 meta-analysis, not only did they not request Ferguson and Kilburn's unpublished data, They also never informed the Ferguson cohort that such a project was in the works, nor did they ask the Ferguson cohort for their unpublished data or papers that they had in press, of which, at the time, there were 2 additional studies. Seemingly willing to do the due diligence that Anderson et al. Were unwilling to do, Ferguson and Kilburn contacted several other scholars who had published research related to games and violence and found that, similarly, none of them had been reached out to for any of their unpublished data, including Barnett, Coulson, and Foreman, Colwell and Cato, Kuttner and Olson, Ryan, Rigby, and Przybylski, Unsworth, Deviley, and Ward, and Williams and Skoric. So that's 17 different scholars known to potentially have unpublished data on this subject matter that Anderson et al. Just did not bother contacting. Who knows just how much was actually passed over? That would not be an issue, by the way, if Anderson et al. Did not posit over and over again the importance of using unpublished data. Unfortunately, that was one of their primary issues with the Ferguson meta-analysis, and supposedly the aspect of their own meta that allowed it to stand out. This isn't cherry-picking, it's cherry-spelunking. Curiously, while Anderson and colleagues seemed unwilling to reach out to other academics in the field for research that might contradict the position of their own research group, they were more than happy to include a plethora of their own unpublished data. Specifically, of 3 in-press manuscripts included, 2 of them were from the Anderson et al. Cohort, and of the conference papers assessed, 9 of the 12 came from that same cohort. Well, that certainly doesn't seem just the slightest bit suspicious for a group claiming that the problem with Ferguson's work was that it didn't include enough unpublished research. Was the issue really that Ferguson insisted on using peer-reviewed work, or was the issue that Anderson et al.'s meta-analysis relied so heavily on their own unpublished work? Let me know what you think in the comments, dear viewer. While Ferguson and Kilburn state they don't believe that this was purposeful on Anderson et al.'s part, I'll say it, I absolutely think it was purposeful on their part, and you'll see more later as to why I believe that to be the case. Rather than focus on Ferguson and colleagues' specific analysis of publication bias, Anderson et al. Are critical of their trim and fill methodology. To simplify, this method trims smaller studies that tend to have more extreme effect sizes from the analysis that may skew the estimate to try and find the true center of the totality of the data, and then fills in the trimmed gaps with counterparts to account for small studies' skewing effects, until the means are relatively equal. Trim and fill is typically used when there is an expectation of bias in the published research, and we've seen why Ferguson had a very good reason to anticipate publication bias regarding this subject matter. All of the scholars involved agree that trim and fill is far from a perfect method. Inherently, trim and fill is not reporting on unbiased effect sizes, but rather serves as a sensitivity estimate. Despite this agreement, however, Anderson et al. Focus almost entirely on their issues with the technique and do not address Ferguson and Kilburn's extensive coverage of the publication bias, as we have covered here today. Publication bias was of particular concern for Ferguson's group because video game violence research was, and clearly still is, a contentious topic with political implications, such as the exact policy remedies called for in Anderson et al.'s own meta. More interestingly, Anderson's work illustrates the importance of understanding publication bias, as his 2004 report, that was the basis for much of this discussion, illustrates that of the 32 published studies assessed in that 2004 paper, 19 supported the notion that games were causally linked to aggression or violence, 9 were inconclusive, and 4 were non-supportive. In contrast, of the 11 unpublished studies, only 1 was supportive, 1 was inconclusive, and 9 were non-supportive. Clearly, there is a very big difference between published and unpublished studies in that published works concerning games and violence are largely those that support the contention that video games are related to or cause violence. If your data don't evidence the pet theory, well, you don't get to publish those data, and that is publication bias. Ferguson and Kilburn go on to point out that Anderson et al. Never mention their concerns with the use of unstandardized measurements, which again, we have discussed in detail in our review of that work. Without standardized measurements, scholars are more able to select findings that best suit their presupposed hypotheses. What Ferguson and Kilburn describe as dropping the worst findings to highlight the best ones that suit one's claims, something that Anderson and his cohort were guilty of in their own work, assessing the noise blast test in different ways across different studies as it best fit their expectations. Once again, Ferguson and Kilburn give the Anderson group the benefit of the doubt and state that they do not believe that this was done intentionally, but rather as an inevitable aspect of human nature that only illustrates the importance of standardization of measurement. And speaking of a lack of standardization, another issue raised in the Anderson et al. Meta is their lack of consistent standards in judging what research they consider as utilizing best practices. As for instance, one study they cite as an excellent example of best practices defined The Sims 2, Tony Hawk's Underground 2, and Final Fantasy as all being non-violent games, when all three certainly contain some violent elements. Now, I know you may be thinking, hang on, The Sims 2 is violent? Really? But according to the ESRB, yes, it does contain mild violence, and to be fair, there aren't a ton of games that are more or less totally violence-free. But one such example would largely be point-and-click adventure games, such as Myst, which Ferguson presumably used for that specific reason, as well as puzzle games and city builders and other simulation games. Although, I mean, I've seen the things that people do in city builders and simulation games.
I want to get off
Ferguson and Kilburn note the inverse negative correlation of negative 0.95 between the increase in violent video game sales and youth violence rates, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the Anderson cohort's seeming unwillingness to account for sex in their analysis, despite recognizing that males tend to be more aggressive and more likely to play violent video games, as Ferguson's cohort had accounted for in their own work. Similarly, Anderson et al. Left out the importance of a history of familial abuse, despite Ferguson's work evidencing its importance as a variable in the total model fit. It's again curious to see these serious confounds were left absent from Anderson et al.'s meta, focusing almost exclusively on the role of video games without accounting for external variables such as sex and upbringing. Again, being charitable, Ferguson and Kilburn go on to display the effects of numerous other variables on criminal behavior, including Anderson's 0.15 estimate, and the table here is, well, telling. Ferguson's estimate, adjusted for publication bias, is just 0.04. Studies on the effects of violent television place its influence at 0.10, and Anderson's places the effects of violent video game play, again, at 0.15. But even if Anderson et al.'s analysis is correct, and we've seen some good evidence as to its numerous severe flaws, let's look at just what that estimate stacks up to. Childhood witnessing of DV on aggression, 0.18. Childhood physical abuse on violence, 0.22. Poverty on crime, 0.25. Aggressive personality on crime, 0.25. Incarceration use as a deterrent on crime, 0.33. Firearm ownership on crime, 0.35. Video game play on cognitive spatial reasoning, 0.36. Protective effect of community institutions on neighborhood crime, 0.39. Self-control and perceptions of criminal opportunity on crime, 0.58. Genetic influences on antisocial behavior, 0.75. And finally, again, video game sales on violent youth activity, negative 0.95. Even if we were to take Anderson et al.'s word using a ton of their own unpublished data and not work that contradicts theirs, and we know we shouldn't at this point for those very reasons, then playing violent video games is still less harmful than pretty much anything else on that list as a predictive factor in criminal and aggressive or violent acts. If we look at Ferguson's report, which aligns seemingly one-to-one with the decrease in youth violence as game sales have increased, however, then not only is there no evidence that games cause violence, they may actually reduce violence. Plus, they may have a positive effect in terms of visual spatial processing. So why all the focus on violent video games? Because, in my opinion at least, Anderson et al. Just don't like video games, and don't have any interest in genuinely studying them, evidenced by the fact that they think The Sims is non-violent.
Oh, happy music! I love when I light a child on fire and the happy music starts to play.
But now let's look at Anderson et al.'s response to really hit that point home, that it seems that Anderson et al. Just don't like video games. First, I need to point out that while I'm saying Anderson et al.'s response, in part this point out of habit, interestingly, the response to Ferguson and Kilburn was not first authored by Dr. Craig Anderson, who up until this paper had put his name front and center on all of these publications. Instead, the response to Ferguson and Kilburn, Much Ado About Something, Violent Video Game Effects, and A School of Red Herring reply to Ferguson and Kilburn, is cited as Bushman, Rothstein, and Anderson. This small detail actually betrays something a little bit interesting that probably mostly only those of us more familiar with academic publication may have recognized, and that is that Anderson chose to assume third authorship on this paper. The order of authorship in academic work means something to academics. A scholar will assume first authorship for a number of reasons, because they really were the lead in charge of the majority of the work, because they were the senior scholar on a project and were supervising junior scholars, or because they have power in their department and first authorship is indicative of power and prestige. Similarly, there are a number of reasons why an academic might choose to place their name lower on the list of authors. Because they didn't have that much to do with the project, because they want to highlight the work of junior scholars and aid in their careers, or because they're just a little bit ashamed and don't want their name to come first when the work is being cited and can instead fall under that et al. Umbrella. I have no definitive idea as to why Anderson chose to serve as third author here, but feel free to surmise for yourself in the comments down below on that one as well.
I'm so sorry, but my wife has made a mistake. I don't know how she did, but she did. She's made a complete pudding of the whole thing as usual. It'll be perfectly all right, you say. I've sorted it all out. I'm frightfully sorry, but you know what women are like. They got one brain between the lot of them. Well, not all of them, but I mean some of them have.
After spending their opening paragraph touting their bona fides, they cite several scholars who have argued that the inclusion of unpublished work is fine and not an issue, while failing to mention that the major concern of Ferguson and Kilburn regarding their use of unpublished studies was not that they were just unpublished, but that the data originated largely from the Anderson cohort, while failing to contact scholars who may have had unpublished work that did not support their existing hypothesis, as confirmed via correspondence with other academics that they had not been reached out to for access to their information. Bushman et al. Go on to continue to criticize Ferguson and Kilburn's use of the trim and film method, and state that they had considered using such methods but avoided doing so. Although they had not stated this in their previous work, they admit that the topic of games and violence carries with it a political aspect, but deny any personal biases, and ultimately disagree with Ferguson and Kilburn's contentions that publication or selection bias could possibly have influenced their results. Bushman et al. Also contend that they didn't intentionally exclude the studies that Ferguson and Kilburn pointed out had been kept out of their meta-analysis, because according to them, they didn't find out about those studies until too late in the process. That's odd because, again, according to the scholars that Ferguson and Kilburn spoke to about it, the Anderson cohort never even contacted them, so that doesn't really seem to track. Someone here is lying. Is it the multiple academics from different research programs that told Ferguson and Kilburn that they had not been contacted? Or is it the Anderson cohort who claimed that the research was just too new for them to include?
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the scholars who are wrong.
As for a study from 2005 that was excluded from the Anderson et al. Report, Bushman et al. State that they did not include it because it only contained a measure of verbal aggression. Recall that they did examine non-physical aggression in their meta-analysis, but because this one study did not also have a physical aggression measure, they just chose not to use it. Or maybe they didn't use it because the data didn't align with their hypothesis, but that's just speculation on my part.
But that's just a theory! A game theory!
Further, Bushman et al. Specifically bring up a poster presentation mentioned in passing by Ferguson and Kilburn from Barnett, Coulson, and Foreman, 2008, that they did not include because it had not yet been published in an academic journal. However, again, recall that it's the Anderson cohort that relies on unpublished data and insists that those data are as valuable as published work. My guess is that the Barnett, Coulson, and Foreman conference paper was supposed to go forward to publication when Ferguson and Kilburn published their paper, but it ended up staying as just a conference poster presentation. That is something worth criticizing Ferguson and Kilburn for, I suppose, because then this poster would not meet Ferguson and Kilburn's own standards. However, the reason Ferguson and Kilburn even mentioned the poster was not because it met their inclusion criteria, but rather because it met Anderson's inclusion criteria, and yet the Anderson cohort failed to contact Barnett, Coulson, and Foreman for their research. They finish off this section by justifying their exclusion of two papers from the same research program, Przybylski et al. 2009 and Ryan Rigby and Przybylski 2006, because they claim that these studies were only interested in why people are motivated to play games. But that's untrue. Przybylski et al. 2009 includes a measure of tension and energy, which is associated with arousal, and which is in turn associated with aggression. Ryan Rigby and Przybylski 2006 conducted 4 studies in their publication, all of which measured mood, another correlate to aggression. So while yes, they didn't measure aggression directly, to describe these two papers as only assessing gameplay motivation is false, And once again, Ferguson and Kilburn's issue was more that Anderson et al. Did not bother to contact these researchers in the first place, more than cite the specific papers they mentioned. Bushman et al. Claim that they are confused as to how Ferguson and Kilburn came to their 0.15 estimate, despite it being pretty damn clear how they did so in their paper, as we've been over. They claim there is no reason to account for risk factors such as depression, peer group influence, and family environment in an experimental study. If you're studying the effects of some stimuli on aggression, those variables are probably going to explain a lot of the variance between subjects and should be accounted for in your model, but okay, Bushman. They go on to pretend not to understand why Ferguson and Kilburn, having accounted for these measures, arrived at a different conclusion than their own analysis that did not account for them, even though you just answered your own question. Then they state that because not all studies include these controls, that it's impossible to account for them at all, and even cite their own work, Anderson 2004, as proof that even when accounting for variables such as depression, peer group influence, and family history, the effects of video games on violence are still significant. So wait, which is it, Bushman et al.? Are these risk factors irrelevant, or are they only relevant when included in your own cohort's research that supports your hypothesis? Well, I for one know which one I think it is. They then go on to note that their effect sizes concerning the influence of violent games on violent behavior are comparable to the effect sizes of exposure to lead, asbestos, or secondhand smoke on physical health, but that is an absolutely absurd comparison to make. The reason Ferguson and Kilburn brought up the differences in effect sizes between gameplay and violence versus smoking and cancer in their own piece was to illustrate just how significant the gap was, although we are all well aware that the main cause of cancer is not smoking, but esports.
Meta this, meta that. Have you ever met a f***ing girl before?
Further, we're not talking about physical health outcomes here. We're talking about violent or aggressive behavior, which Ferguson and Kilburn illustrated is vastly, vastly more influenced by factors such as genetic influences, self-control, and protective communities than violent video games or television exposure. Bushman et al. Finally sink to the absolute bottom of the barrel to defend their work by appealing to authority, citing a 2001 congressional report that found, quote, entertainment violence can lead to increases in aggressive attitudes, values, and behavior, particularly in children, end quote. Well, gee, I wonder where the US government could have gotten such a notion that this was settled science when members of your own cohort had made such reports to the US Senate. Bushman et al. Repeat their conclusion from Anderson et al. That even if the effect sizes are small, and therefore should be of similar concern to any other social factor that may contribute to violence. Further, while they agree with Ferguson and Kilburn that the type of violent behavior that may be influenced by violent gameplay exposure is likely to produce less severe acts of aggression than other factors, they contend this should not exclude games as a concern to society as a contributor to violent behavior, no matter how minimal, because severe acts of violence are relatively rare anyway. So they admit that violent games are minorly associated with aggression, and that the aggression they may induce is non-severe, but we still need to be worried about them, and presumably get the government involved to regulate them.
Guns don't kill people, the government does.
They next address the issue of unstandardized measures of aggression, which they state is fine because the effect sizes produced from various different measures were similar. But the problem with that is one of construct validity. Sure, all of these measures may produce similar outputs, but are they actually measuring the same construct? Without definitive proof of concurrent validity, that is, knowing that both measures are definitively measuring the same thing, purpose of using the same measure is to know that whatever you are measuring, it's the same construct every single time. The next segment addressing the phantom violent youth crisis is frankly baffling, as Bushman, despite just lines earlier defaulting to an appeal to authority from the US government in one paragraph, and going off about the compounding nature of small effect sizes of games on violence over time as a unique contributing factor in another, then just outright say that violence is affected by so many risk factors that the inverse increase in people playing violent video games compared to violent youth rates is simply because there are too many variables to account for. Again, I must ask, which is it? Are games a serious issue, or are they so minor as to be undetectable in broader social trends? Bushman et al. Conclude that their focus on games is because it's the easiest factor for parents to influence, which, comparatively to, say, genetic factors, sure is true, and I would agree that parents absolutely should monitor the kind of media that their children are exposed to. But that is not what Anderson et al. 2010, this exact same research program, concluded just months prior, which was that the solution was government involvement and policy change, presumably not just for children, but for all consumers of video games. They further claim adamantly that their research program was not trying to invent a phantom youth crisis. But really, is that why, following the tragedy at Columbine, all the way back in 2000, Dr. Craig Anderson testified before the US Senate that, quote, even though one cannot reasonably claim that a particular act of violence or that a lifetime of violence was caused exclusively by the perpetrator's exposure to violent entertainment media, one can reasonably claim that such exposure was a contributing causal factor. More importantly for this hearing, my research colleagues are correct in claiming that high exposure to media violence is a major contributing cause of the high rate of violence in modern US society, end quote. If your program was not trying to invent such a phantom youth crisis, then why was the head of said program petitioning the US government to not only convince them that such a crisis was in fact happening, but that they needed to impose policy to counteract it? Before launching into their conclusion, their final critique of Ferguson's work, more broadly, is his use of the same studies across multiple meta-analyses, ranging from 54% to 100% overlap. But the obvious purpose in doing so is to continue to add more studies as more are published, such as to continue to confirm the data over time with new evidence, something we know that the Anderson cohort isn't interested in doing unless the data are unpublished and support their hypothesis, so no wonder it irritated them. They conclude that, while yes, the effect sizes are often so small as to be seen as trivial, because experts, physicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists disagree with Ferguson and Kilburn, it doesn't really matter how trivial the results are. They still need to be taken seriously. Apparently not to evidence some phantom youth violence crisis, which they totally weren't trying to sell to the US government, despite admitting, again, to its triviality. This wasn't the first time that Anderson had stuck his nose into influencing policy either, dear viewer. Remember that 2005 APA report? Who do you think helped draft that report, and what research do you think it cited to determine as a foregone conclusion that games were a serious public health concern that were causally linked to violence? Why, it was, among others, Dr. Craig Anderson and Dr. Brad Bushman, whose work largely comprised the supposed settled science contained within said report. Following Bushman et al.'s reply to Ferguson and Kilburn, that particular battle of the science wars more or less came to a close, but the conflict was far from over. The back and forth between these two groups of scholars set the stage for much of what has happened since in the discourse surrounding games, aggression, violence, and as a result, gaming culture more broadly. When activists, let alone the US and Canadian governments, start talking about toxic gamers, they are still, to this day, citing Anderson's work while typically avoiding Ferguson's. But I hope I have illustrated, in extensive detail, the issue with Anderson and his cohort's work. But now, with a thorough understanding of the science war, let's look at some of the other issues facing game scholarship that have continued to plague the field in the years since, to better understand if games and gamers really are toxic. While the science wars of 2010 may have rocked at least some of academia's perceptions of the claims that video games were causally related to violence, which even by that point had seeped out of the mainstream moral panic and into the academy, or vice versa, that was only the beginning. And as one traces the spread of these beliefs from kooks like Jack Thompson through pop culture, now with seeming backing from scholars such as Anderson and their cohort, it was all both sensationalist media and other academics needed to allow those roots to flourish into truisms. By late 2013, the first iterations of the whole GamerGate phenomena were percolating on blogs and image boards before having a proper name and long before becoming the enormous dumpster fire it would end up being, let alone the perpetual media bogeyman that it's been used as ever since. However, there was also a conflict brewing in academia regarding the same subject matter. That 2005 APA report, written in part by Anderson and Bushman, citing their own work as the final word on the subject matter, was starting to come under some scrutiny. As in September of 2013, 238 psychologists, media scholars, and criminologists wrote an open letter to the APA task force requesting that the organization review and revise their policies due to the plethora of research such as that of Ferguson and Kilburn, among many others, that contradicted the 2005 claims still on the record as fact.
Well,
hang on, you've just... No, I like it. This is brilliant, but I like this.
These scholars were adamant that their concerns were that policy made on inconsistent or weak evidence makes for bad policy, and offered their services to the APA in revising the standards. Despite hundreds of scholars imploring the APA to revisit their policies, in 2015, the association reaffirmed its stance that games are associated with increased aggressive thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. At least this time, though, they had the wherewithal to not include either Anderson or Bushman on the task force panel. But we'll discuss the details of those actually involved in that second report and the report itself in more detail a little bit later. Around the same time, the APA came under fire from a very different direction and brought broader public skepticism into the integrity of the organization. In 2014, James Risen published a book titled Pay Any Price: Greed, Power, and Endless War, which contended that the APA worked with the Bush administration to develop new torture techniques during the War on Terror. Although the APA initially denied Risen's claims, a 2014 through 2015 investigation, commonly referred to as the Hoffman Report, confirmed that members of APA staff and leadership had collaborated with the Bush government to study and invent new torture programs. By May of 2015, the academic side of GamerGate also reached the mainstream, as illustrated by an interaction between Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the man behind the infamous Stanford prison experiment, widely believed to be one of the most unethical studies in the history of social science, and Dr. Andrew Przybylski, whose name has come up several times already, being one of the researchers in what Markey and Ferguson, 2017, would describe as the rebel alliance of scholars standing up against the empire of establishment academic hegemony. While Zimbardo waffles on, Przybylski is clear on his position and that of those contesting the idea that games are some great social ill, that the data are entirely correlational, and that true causal longitudinal analysis is impossible in this case, leaving us with nothing but short-term effects at best from experimental studies, that the effect sizes are small, and that those who are affected by games are those who tend to have underlying psychological issues for which games are often being used as a palliative or an outlet, and that there are countless societal problems that we know have causal links with violence that are of far more pressing concern than the minuscule, non-causal effect of video games on a very small subsection of the population. To which Dr. Zimbardo illustrates exactly the kind of treatment that so many game scholars were, by that point, just familiar with. He simply ignores everything Dr. Przybylski has to say.
What you're highlighting are potential risks. So it might be the case that something has a negative effect, but the causal evidence is not there. Compared to something like poverty or mental health care access, real problems with young people, or things like self-injurious behavior or anorexia, which actually are on the rise with young people in this country, something like video games and the evidence base just isn't there.
Yeah, okay. Anyway.
While the point of this video is not really to relitigate any of the specific events that comprise the shit show known as GamerGate, it is important to note that while gamers were protesting for ethics in games journalism, media psychology, and specifically game studies, was experiencing a parallel event. Before we get into some of the direct aftermath of this science war, I think it's important to cover a major issue that we keep running into in this area of inquiry, which is that there is significant disagreement, at least from the two cohorts that we looked at extensively, as to how exactly to study games and aggression or violence at all. Even a single instrument can yield vastly different results depending on a variety of factors, meaning that this issue is more complicated than just consistency in instrumentation, as seen in an analysis from Elson et al. 2014, who reviewed a single measure of aggression used frequently in laboratory research, the Competitive Reaction Time Task, or CRTT, by which participants are led to believe that they are able to punish another participant with an electric shock should the fellow participant lose in a competitive reaction time game. Very similar to the Milgram experiment, and again, no one actually gets shocked.
I hate this reoccurring meme.
While participating, subjects are able to select how severe the supposed shock will be, which serves as a measurement of degrees of aggression. However, Elson et al.'s review revealed just how inconsistent the results of this test can be, at least as it relates to video games. In their first study, participants played the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion and were instructed to use either stealth to avoid combat, or use violence to solve either a quest to rescue an NPC or to search for treasure. There were 4 conditions: rescue, helping without violence; kill, violence only; help, helping only, and treasure hunt. No helping and no violence.
Come on, guys, come on in. Come on into this tiny little cavern. We're all gonna sleep in the bed together like grown boys. This is what true friends do, you know? When you're grown up, when you're an adult, only your best friends sleep in your single bed with you.
Afterward, participants engaged in a CRTT task, supposedly with another subject. The second study used Unreal Tournament as its stimuli, broken down into non-violent versus violent and normal versus high-speed conditions. In the third study, participants played a match of 2010 FIFA World Cup South Africa with a research confederate. That is, someone working with the researchers, who was instructed to either win or intentionally lose, and to either be friendly or engage in a little trash talk, including ironic, snarky remarks such as, "nice pass."
And again, turning to the camera to remind the now grieving parents of their dead enemies that this is what happens when you let your sons play with killers.
Participants then once again completed the CRTT task with a different alleged participant. The results were legitimately all over the place, with effect sizes ranging from 0.0 to 0.10 in Study 1, 0.0 to 0.39 in Study 2, and 0.09 to 0.20 in Study 3. Results from just Study 2 were indicative that playing a violent digital game could have increased aggression via the use of higher volume settings in the CRTT task, decreased it, or had absolutely no effect based on which aggression score was being calculated. In Study 3, one variant produced significant effect sizes, while the other 5 did not. Further, in Study 1, having the largest sample size and the most consistent effects did not produce results that were statistically significant. Thus, we can further see an issue of measurement that was continuing to plague the field, despite the science supposedly having been settled all the way back in 2005 and then reaffirmed in 2015. In the subsequent years since the science wars, several scholars returned to that Anderson et al. Meta-analysis that not only sparked so much disagreement between academics, but that seemingly influenced the APA to maintain their decade-old standards, concluding once again that the causal link between violent games and violent behavior was settled science. Hilgard, Engelhardt, and Rounder 2017 conducted a reanalysis of Anderson et al. 2010 and found some pretty serious issues that weren't raised before, having been given access to their original data, likely after years of pressure. First, they removed 2 studies from the meta-analysis, Penny and Ballard 2002 for only assessing aggression within the video game, not outside of it, and Graybill, Kirsch, and Esselman 1985 because it measured the direction of aggression, not the degree of it. Recall that Anderson et al. Justified the exclusion of studies from Przybylski because they did not include a direct measurement of aggression, yet included these 2 studies. Guess that was just an oversight, huh? As for the meta-analysis itself, Hildegard et al. Found significant funnel plot asymmetry and biasing towards studies with measures of aggression over those with proxy variables, resulting in an overestimation of effect sizes. For the best practice subset of studies, the supposed cream of the crop of data, Hildegard et al. Suggested a downward adjustment using multiple methods ranging from -0.05 to -0.15. For papers specifically assessing aggressive behavior, the estimated reduction fell between -0.06 and -0.19, the latter of which would leave the effects of violent gameplay on aggressive behavior at just 0.02, a completely irrelevant effect. For violent thoughts, one estimate suggested increasing the effect by 0.02, but the rest suggested a negative orientation ranging from -0.03 to -0.12, with the latter leaving the effect of violent gameplay on aggressive thoughts at 0.10, just above the minimum to even be considered a small effect size. For the effects of games on physiological arousal, and for studies that used cross-sectional methods, the authors found no need for adjustment. In total then, they concluded that the effect sizes for games on aggressive behaviors likely falls between 0.02 and 0.09, effect sizes so small as to potentially be considered null. Although the authors do note that it's important to also use caution in not taking these estimates as definitive either. But the point is that Anderson et al.'s own analysis, when reassessed with various meta-analytical methods, could be interpreted as evidencing that there either is no link between playing violent video games and aggressive behaviors, or one so small as to be negligible. When including unpublished dissertations into the analysis, remember, the kind of thing that Anderson et al. Were so adamant was perfectly fine for them to do, things also changed a bit. Specifically, for aggressive emotions, estimates fell from 0.22 to 0.02. For aggressive behavior, from 0.17 to 0.01. for aggressive thoughts from 0.20 to 0.13, illustrating some pretty robust support for the evidence of a publication bias in the field, in that media psychology journals are only interested in publishing data that supports their existing beliefs, as backed up by the APA, that games are correlationally, if not causally, linked to aggression, and any evidence to the contrary simply remains unpublished. Anderson et al.'s meta wasn't the only thing to be scrutinized in more detail after the fact, at least once the flames surrounding the mid-2010s games discourse had largely subsided, as in 2020, Ferguson, Copenhaver, and Markey also published a re-examination of the findings from the APA in their 2015 decision to ignore the recommendations of over 200 media scholars in favor of repeating the standards derived from Anderson and Bushman, amongst others, again, all the way back in 2005. Given that a majority issue of contention with the 2005 report was that it was written in part by Anderson and Bushman and relied heavily on their work, the 2015 task force was designed to specifically exclude scholars with any vested interest in the subject matter. But, of course, that's not what actually ended up happening. Two members of the task force, Drs. Hamby and Dodge, had signed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the case of Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association in 2011, arguing that video games do not count as free speech, which was not the decision that the court ultimately reached. Dr. Graham had previously signed a public statement associating violent media to actual violence, and finally Dr. Calvert had conducted research on violent video games despite the task force's explicit supposed exclusion of scholars who had worked in the field. Clearly, the conflict of interest in the scholars chosen for this task force was barely less egregious than in the original 2005 report. Further, despite the fact that the document often uses associative, correlational language, other parts use causal language, making it unclear if the APA is stating definitively that games cause violent behavior or are just related to aggression or anything in between. As for the actual meta-analysis conducted by the APA, the authors state they used, quote, causal inference, ecological validity, sampling validity, and measurement of independent and dependent variables to whittle down their inclusion criteria from 170 studies to 31, and then again down to just 18, yet do not explain their methods for doing so, nor give almost any details regarding the selection process.
By the powers invested in me by a bloke I met in the pub, who knew for definite I find your sort guilty of pedophilia.
There also is a surprising lack of consistency in the measures used by the included research, as some studies that used the heavily validated child behavior checklist were excluded, while studies using the widely criticized competitive reaction time test were included. Of the 18 studies that ended up in the final analysis, 5 or 18% had serious issues raised by Ferguson et al. Specifically, A. Happ, Meltzer, and Stefkin, 2013, contrasted different characters in a violent game, but had no non-violent control. B. Kramer and Lachlan, 2009, failed to include a non-violent game control condition and used a substandard no game control instead. C. Kramer and Farrar, 2009, failed to include a non-violent control condition and used a substandard no game control instead. D. Lin, 2013, merely compared movies and video games with no non-violent controls. And E. Wang et al., 2009, did not include any measures of aggressive behavior and relied on functional fMRI results only, the interpretation of which can be ambiguous." End quote. The problem with most of these studies is that they have no non-violent control, which means that any results that are derived from exposure to a violent video game cannot be compared to exposure to a non-violent video game, and thus these results are functionally meaningless without a baseline against which to contrast them to determine if the violent video game uniquely affected aggression. Regarding the fMRI study, another similar study was dropped from the analysis with no reason given, making it only further seem as if much, if not all, of the study selection process in this APA task force analysis was at best arbitrary and at worst political. In order to validate the results from the APA task force, Ferguson et al. Conducted their own meta-analysis, again, using studies published between 2009 and 2013, replicating the procedures of the APA. Unlike the authors of the APA report, Ferguson et al. Are explicit in their analysis, which required research meet one or all of the following criteria for inclusion in the meta: comparison of violent gameplay to non-violent gameplay, and includes a measurement of aggression, correlational data regarding exposure to violent games with aggression, pro-social behavior or desensitization, longitudinal data regarding violent video game exposure with the aforementioned variables, and that these studies present statistically significant data able to be converted into an effect size. That the study include a control group, that the data were only used once and not repeated in other studies included, and that the study included a dependent variable such as aggression, prosocial behavior, or desensitization, which would discount some of the fMRI studies that were only looking at brain activity, not outcomes. That the study included a measurement of third variables such as gender, trait aggression, or family history, and that the violent and non-violent video games were carefully matched as to be analogous in terms of difficulty, competitiveness, and a lack of storyline. This search resulted in 61 publications that were included in the meta. They found that even a direct replication of the APA task force's analysis resulted in smaller effect sizes than those reported by the APA, and further, that the best practice studies produced the weakest effects of all, being statistically non-delineable from zero. Only the effects of desensitization were larger in this recreation, but only when including non-best practice studies. Most studies were experimental, indicating short-term effects rather than longitudinal. They also found that, based on their search of the same literature, their analysis included more best practice studies than did the APA's, 45% versus 22.2%. Bivariate analysis revealed that the effect of video games on aggressive behavior, that was either correlational or longitudinal, accounted for 2.5% of variance. However, under controlled analysis, this was reduced to 0.05 of the variance in aggressive behavior that was accounted for by longitudinal or correlational exposure to violent video games. That's what we like to call XCOM levels of accuracy. In total, experimental studies did tend to have larger effect sizes than other types of analysis, although Ferguson et al.'s finding was still lower than the APA's report, coming in at 0.14, followed by correlational data coming in at 0.08, and finally longitudinal data coming in at 0.07, which might be why scholars with a point to prove tend to prioritize experimental studies over other types. Just to explicate why this is likely the case, it's because experimental studies are looking at immediate reactions to stimuli, so it makes sense why experimental studies would produce the strongest effects. But those effects are not generalizable to the totality of people who play violent video games, and really only indicate that at best, right after playing a violent game, people might be just a little bit more emotionally and psychologically aroused by the stimuli, and as a result, may be more prone towards some aggressive behaviors. However, once again, there is extremely limited evidence that there is any significant effect of playing violent video games on aggression, either as a correlation or as a longitudinal result. And thus, to summarize, the APA was wrong when drawing from Anderson and Bushman's data in 2005, and they were wrong when confirming that 2005 report again in 2015 in their contention that there was any support, let alone definitive causal evidence, that video games are responsible for violence. There was barely any correlational evidence, let alone causal. In February of 2020, the APA again reaffirmed the findings of the 2015 resolution, which itself reaffirmed the findings of the 2005 report largely influenced by Anderson and Bushman. If the evidence that games really have these deleterious effects that are bandied about so readily, not only by scholars whose work is repeated ad nauseum, but also by major academic institutions such as the APA, which ultimately go on to influence policy and social order, are actually so negligible, then why do these scholars keep pushing the narrative that their data are anything but negligible? Why is it that so many scholars, whose job is supposed to be to discover the truth, are seemingly so willing to either lie, in the worst possible interpretation, or be so sloppy when dealing with an issue they themselves claim is of such great import? Yes, gamers are the real problem facing society today, says organization that helped the Bush administration learn how to more effectively psychologically and physiologically torture people.
Joey, can you open up the iDubbbz gaslighting document? Stage fight over who gets to use the alias Cream Boy?
The real question we must ask is why? I think that a quote from Markey and Ferguson, 2017, might provide some insight into the question. Quote, "We would like to think all scientists hold themselves to a higher standard, but unfortunately, remaining above the fray does not pay well. Scholars can get grant funding, professional prestige, and newspaper coverage for their work by tying their research to the current moral panic, and the more extreme their statements, the more coverage they receive. social science during a moral panic begins to look and behave less like an actual science and more like a convenient way to benefit from social agendas." End quote. It certainly seems that some scholars, such as Anderson, considering his involvement with the APA and his reports to the US government, do have an agenda beyond actually understanding the effect of video games on aggression and violence, let alone any other variables. So what about those other variables? If games do not make people more aggressive or violent, as we have so often been told, if gamers aren't bad people by nature of being gamers, then are there any significant effects of gameplay? If games don't cause people to become violent sociopaths, beyond just being fun, are there any other effects of playing video games, good or bad, that may be of importance given the vast number of people who play video games and the vast number of people seemingly so invested in controlling the narratives within video games? In addition to being accused of making people violent and aggressive, perhaps one of the most common claims about the effect that games have on players is that they keep gamers inside all day, unable to touch grass, and make them depressed, sad, lonely people. After all, one of the major contentions of people like those at Sweet Baby Inc. is that gamers are a bunch of socially inept man-babies. So do games negatively influence well-being? We can answer that question by looking to a study from Rior et al. 2022, who collaborated with several game publishers to collect longitudinal survey data from players of 7 very different titles: Animal Crossing New Horizons, Apex Legends, EVE Online, Forza Horizon 4, Gran Turismo Sport, Outriders, and The Crew 2, to examine the effects of gameplay over the course of 4 weeks. Over this period, players were surveyed 3 separate times. Respondents were asked each time to recall how they had felt during the past 2 weeks, and asked to report how often they experienced 6 positive and 6 unpleasant feelings on a scale ranging from rarely or never to often or always, as well as to imagine a ladder with 10 rungs, with the top representing their best possible life and the lowest representing their worst possible life, and asked where they felt they currently fell on the ladder. Bros asked them to tier list their life, essentially. Additionally, participants were asked to report their experiences of feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the latter only for multiplayer games, all while playing games over the past 2 weeks. Results indicated little to no impact on affect, with the small effects that were present leaning towards positive affect with a 68% probability. Increases in the amount of time played also was not associated with current affect. Similarly, there was no relationship between gameplay or time spent playing and life satisfaction, although this probability leans negative with an 82% probability. Specifically then, given that the average range of time spent playing games was about a half an hour, were a typical player to go from their absolute minimum amount of time spent gaming to their maximum in a week, their affect, that is, positive emotional response, would increase by 0.013, and life satisfaction decrease by 0.02. In other words, gaming has absolutely no effect on well-being over time, although there are of course always some outliers.
Genshin Impact is a game which has sucked away my soul and killed my dog.
Running the numbers in the opposite direction to detect if changes in life satisfaction or affect altered gameplay habits revealed the same thing, that is to say, absolutely nothing. There were some effects though as it concerned motivation, as players who were intrinsically motivated to play reported significant increases in life satisfaction and affect, while those who were extrinsically motivated reported significant decreases in both. That is, those who play games out of a sense of compulsion, rather than because they just want to, are likely going to be the people who may experience losses in personal well-being as a result. If you feel like you need to play a game because you're part of a guild or a group, or because you stream games, that can negatively impact your life. But for the most part, games have no influence on life satisfaction and affect, and have positive effects if you actively want to play that game. It turns out all you have to do to not have video games ruin your life is to actually like playing video games, which we know no one actually does.
I don't get it. This is so gay, to post about Fincher, but you don't even play.
But it's for yous. Should post to get some more views. Bump your big friend so real posts don't get views.
If not violence, then what about morals? Does exposure to games, including violent ones that may reward immoral activities, alter the moral framework of gamers? Hodge, Taylor, and McGallany, 2020, examined the effects of gameplay on moral reasoning in a sample of university students. participants completed the social moral reflection measure, which asked questions about the importance of keeping promises, telling the truth, saving others' lives, stealing, and otherwise breaking the law. Respondents were further asked if they played video games, and if so, their average duration of playtime, genres played, average content rating of their preferred games, and whether or not they identified as a gamer.
PewDiePie's live, first string, we back, baby. What happened to him? He crossed another bridge. Get it? Haha. Funny. Hilarious. Remember that one? I don't.
Finally, participants were asked a series of questions regarding how they typically felt when playing video games. They found pretty immediate evidence of significant sex differences, with males being 27 times more likely to identify as a gamer, between 8 and 9 times more likely to play violent games, 12 times more likely to play games that included moral storylines, and 5 times more likely to play Grand Theft Auto compared to females. At the same time, males presented with more developed moral systems than did females. Curiously, participants who identified as gamers but did not currently play games had highly developed morals, as did those who identified as gamers and still played games, compared to non-players and non-gamers. That is, contrary to the truisms about gamers being awful, toxic people, these data actually indicate that gamers and people who play games tend to have a more advanced sense of morality than those that do not. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, as so many games press players to make moral decisions, be it RPGs like Mass Effect or shooters like Spec Ops: The Line. Games, and specifically games that players actually love, such as the two aforementioned titles, often force players to think about the consequences of their actions without forcing politics or specific moral messages down their throats, as companies like Sweet Baby Inc. are paid to inject into more modern titles. If gamers are just as morally developed, if not more so than non-gamers, what about emotional detection? Does long-term exposure to video games make gamers insensitive or cruel the way they are so often described, being blamed for supposed hate campaigns against developers and journalists? This question was assessed in 2 studies by Miedzobroska et al. 2021, who examined the effects of violent video gameplay on detection, specifically of negative emotions in others, which can play an important role in social interaction and specifically in knowing how and when to behave empathetically towards others. If you can't detect negative emotions, you're not going to know when to say sorry. In their first study, high school participants completed a questionnaire regarding trait empathy, self-control, and aggressiveness, as well as their gameplay habits, including hours played in the previous month, favored game genres, and most favorite game. The violence or non-violence of players' selected favored games were determined via the PEGI rating system. After completing the questionnaire, subjects were exposed to various images of the faces of men and women expressing different emotions, and asked to identify the emotion depicted, and timed on the expediency of their response. Of this sample, 41.8% frequently played violent games, 39% did not play any video games at all, and 19% played non-violent games. At the most basic level, there was a negative relationship between playing violent games and both emotional recognition and trait empathy. Regression analysis further revealed that even when controlling for empathy, gender, and age, violent video game play did appear to consistently remain related to decreased capacity to accurately identify negative emotions specifically, and explained more of the variance than the other variables. To elucidate upon this relationship, in their second study, a nearly identical experiment was conducted in a sample of Polish university students. The characteristics of this sample were rather different from the first, with 17.2% being regular players of violent games, 73.5% having little to no experience with video games, and only 9.3% who regularly played non-violent games. Males played more violent games than did females, but in this sample, reaction speed to the emotional detection task was unrelated to playing violent games. However, regression analysis again revealed decreased capacity for accurate detection of negative emotions related to violent video game play. In other words, people who play more violent games may be a bit less able to easily detect negative facial expressions. But what does that mean practically? First, it's important to keep in mind that, as we've discussed, people who are inherently more aggressive are more uniquely drawn to violent games, not that games induce the aggression, which was not taken into consideration in this report. Outside of that consideration, it does seem that heavy gamers might be a bit more insensitive than non-gamers, sure. But once again, that doesn't mean that they lack morals, as we have seen, and this may be why very sensitive people, like the journalist class, are calling for the purge of toxic gamers, not because gamers are immoral, but because at worst, they might just be slightly less aware of the constant deluge of negative emotions these same types of people are seemingly plagued by, and therefore are less sensitive to their feelings. Or at least, that's my hypothesis. The author suggested that this result may be because it would be disadvantageous to be acutely aware of the negative, simulated emotions of NPCs when you're gunning them down in a competitive, violent game, which is also a very reasonable explanation. So are gamers really less able to detect emotions in others then? Well, when we look at the human brain itself, it doesn't seem so. Not Zizik, they are actually different.
They embraced me and they told me, you can call me Gamer. You know, when they tell you this, it means we are really close.
Sought to understand if gamers' brains react to emotional stimuli differently from those of non-gamers, or if they were, in fact, desensitized to understanding the emotions of others. To study this, they recruited 28 adult male subjects who played at least 2 hours of either Counter-Strike, Call of Duty, or Battlefield daily for 2 studies in which they were exposed to a series of positive, negative, or neutral images, as determined by the lead researcher and 2 assistants, all while neural activation in response to the images was measured via fMRI. Simply put, across both studies, they found no significant difference between activation in regions of the brain known to be sensitive to emotional stimuli, such as the amygdala and the parahippocampal gyrus. So at least in terms of brain activation, it seems that gamers are just as able to detect emotions as are non-gamers. A similar study from Gao et al. 2017 examined the long-term effects of playing games on empathy specifically for others' pain in a sample of Chinese undergraduates. Participants were asked what their 3 favorite games were, how many hours they played of games per week, and how violent they rated their video game content on a scale from not at all to extremely. 18 subjects who preferred violent games and 17 subjects who preferred non-violent games answered a questionnaire measuring their trait perspective taking, fantasy thinking, empathetic concern, and personal distress, and were then shown images that either depicted some normal activity or the same normal activity but with a painful aspect, such as a person slicing a cucumber or, well, attempting to slice a cucumber and instead cutting their own finger. Broadly speaking, viewing the pain of others tends to activate the right supramarginal gyrus, lateral middle occipital gyrus, lateral fusiform gyrus, right inferior occipital gyrus, inferior parietal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and visual-related regions, including the secondary visual cortex. Both groups, violent video game players and non-violent video game players, expressed significant activations to about the same degrees in the lateral occipital gyrus, lateral fusiform gyrus, right middle temporal gyrus, and the secondary visual cortex, indicating that people who play violent games recognize and respond to images of pain in others in exactly the same way as people who prefer to play non-violent video games. Just because games depict violence does not mean that people who play them do not respond to images of real harm differently from those who do not. What about another common trope of gamers? That they're a bunch of man-baby failures, hence the very game company name Sweet Baby in the first place. Are gamers really more likely to be failures? Well, data from Latinsky and Ueno 2020, drawing from over 15,000 participants involved in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent and Adult Health between 1994 and 2009, don't really seem to indicate that. Weekly hours of games played, timely high school completion, college completion, moving out of one's parental home, successful employment, marriage, and parental status were all assessed, as well as the education and income of participants' parents. In general, there was no relationship between all gameplay and high school completion. However, there was a small negative effect only in girls. That is, girls who played a lot of games in adolescence, not boys, were less likely to finish high school on time. Higher levels of gameplay, between 5 and 13 hours a week, were associated with decreased timely high school completion, but lower levels, 1 to 4 hours, were unrelated. For college graduation, students who played 1 to 4 hours a week of video games were actually more likely to graduate than those who played no games whatsoever. It was only in students who played for more than 14 hours a week that gameplay became associated with decreased chances of graduation. The same trends appeared when looking at moving out of the parental home, as those who played no games at all were less likely to move out than those who played between 1 and 4 hours of games a week, and those who played no games were about as likely to move out as those who played between 5 and 13 hours a week. However, women who played no games were more likely to have moved out than women who played games between 5 and 13 hours, compared to men who were about equally likely between those two groups. Once again, it was only when gameplay exceeded 14 hours a week that the likelihood of moving out decreased. At the same time, men who played more than 14 hours of games a week were only slightly less likely to be employed full-time than any other group, and women who played for more than 14 hours a week were as likely to be employed as any other woman. The one area that games did seem negatively associated with, however, was romance. I'm sure to everyone's shock, as all levels of play were associated with decreased probability of having been married, peaking in significance for those who played more than 14 hours weekly. However, this effect only occurred in women who spent a moderate amount of time playing games. That might be the case because women may tend to play more single-player games rather than multiplayer games that involve more social interaction and opportunities for gamers to, well, connect. All levels of play were also associated with decreased likelihood of having a child. This was the case across both sexes, and most pronounced in those who played for more than 14 hours a week. The Sims and its consequences have been a disaster for mankind. In total then, while being a gamer might reduce your probability of reproducing and being married, at least if you're a woman, for the most part, light to moderate gameplay is actually positively associated with various common indicators of life success. Because of the ubiquity of the claims that games are associated with aggression, if not outright violence, we should probably examine the possibility that the very idea of gamers being toxic has become in and of itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell someone over and over again that they're aggressive, that they're a bad person, well, maybe they'll act more aggressively. Maybe they will become a worse person.
People keep asking if I'm back, and I haven't really had an answer. But now, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
We're back to beating women.
Which was the exact subject of interest to Rigidol 2023. What, if any, is the effect of the belief that one can be affected by violent video games on subsequent aggression? Undergraduate students were asked to what degree, from strongly agree to strongly disagree, they aligned with the following two statements. Quote, "Playing violent video games doesn't affect me. They're fun and don't make me behave aggressively." End quote. And quote, "Playing violent video games is kind of risky, because playing them a lot can make me behave more aggressively." End quote.
"This Hegelian pussy got me acting unwise," and so on.
After answering the questions, participants were randomly assigned to play one of two versions of Doom 2 Hell on Earth, either the violent base game where you kill demons, or a modified version using a teleportation gun to send the demons safely to jail.
I'm going to jail!
Afterwards, participants played a reaction time game supposedly with another player, and could select the decibel of the noise blast to punish the other person with when they lost the task. Again, an instrument we're well familiar with by now. Frequency of violent video game consumption and trade aggression were also measured. Participants who reported that they were not vulnerable to becoming more aggressive from playing games described both versions of Doom 2 as less violent than those who felt that they were vulnerable to aggression. There was no difference between the intensity of the noise blast for violent and non-violent versions of Doom 2 within groups. However, this was not the case for vulnerable participants who actually administered stronger shocks after playing the non-violent game compared to the violent one. Between groups, vulnerable participants gave less intense shocks than invulnerable participants. In total then, people who think that video games have no effect on aggressive behavior may, in fact, be more likely to enact more aggressive behaviors after playing a video game. However, violent games did not produce more aggression than did non-violent games. It was the same either way. In total then, it seems that not only do violent games not make people more aggressive, but instead that it is individual differences between people, be that trait aggression, family background, or even just beliefs about one's personal susceptibility to being influenced by violent games, that actually affects aggressive behaviors, not games themselves. Compared to other variables such as genetic predisposition, poverty, and neighborhood crime, games have a negligible effect on aggression and, in the other direction, also probably have some small positive effects on things like life satisfaction and positive emotions, so long as they're played in moderation. So, with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions about the myths of games causing aggression, of the toxic gamer, and the fundamental need for change in the gaming industry to reform gaming by forcing the picky baby to consume politics rather than fun. Play may seem to be one of the most trivial things in human life, After all, it means nothing, right? It's just a game. Or is it? Play is universal. Animals play just as do humans, and humans from every culture on Earth have created a myriad of methods of play. Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, in his foundational treatise Homo Ludens, Man at Play, describes games as something not just separate from ordinary life, but which suspends ordinary life. Games are a form of ritual that involve their own myths and evoke imaginative thinking in a consecrated spot. In that way, the football pitch, the chessboard, the computer desk are all akin in the ritual of play as to the church in the performance of the ritual of worship. While within the game, within the ritual, all players exist inside a magic circle of seemingly arbitrary rules, yet rules which must be followed and lead to ostracism if violated. Cheating in a game is similar to heresy, having broken the sacred rules of the circle. As with faith, play often involves a community of those who abide by the same holy order of the game, and bonds formed within that circle frequently remain after the ritual ends. Games are inherently neither moral nor immoral. They exist in a para-reality outside of society but also within it. They teach lessons, order, culture, cooperation, kinship, but also war, violence, and competition, all silently and safely via simulation through the very practice of play. Man invented games, but man, as a species, is drawn to all play inherent. All men play, and to deny the intrinsic nature of the need to play is to deny a fundamental aspect of the human condition. We have always played, and we always will, developing new methods, new consecrated spots, new magic circles, yet play will always be the nature of mankind. No amount of DEI cash infusions, government crackdowns, nor social pressure will ever change the need to play, nor the way in which people enjoy, learn, and develop as players. Jules Hardy can call for a final purge of the so-called toxic gamers from video games all she likes. Her calls are hollow, as you can never purge the desire need to play from the interminable human spirit. For all of our differences, we are all Homo Ludens, and always will be. In closing, I want to leave you with the words of Johan Huizinga himself, who wrote in the introduction to his magnum opus, quote, "Since the reality of play extends beyond the sphere of human life, it cannot have its foundations in any rational nexus, because this would limit it to mankind. The incidence of play is not associated with any particular stage of civilization or view of the universe. Any thinking person can see at a glance that play is a thing on its own, even if his language possesses no general concept to express it. Play cannot be denied. You can deny, if you like, nearly all abstractions: justice, beauty, truth, goodness, mind, God. You can deny seriousness, but not play." But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think games, even violent games, have any real negative or positive effect on society or individual personal levels of aggression or violence? Is the concern with violent games and aggression in gamers legitimate, or is it all performative and political? Do you believe that video games have had a positive or negative influence on your own life? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, because I genuinely am interested, but also because it helps this video in the algorithm so it's easier for others to find it. And while you're down there, if you liked the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you're not already subscribed for more social science content. As you might imagine, these videos take a long time to research, write, and edit, so if you want to see more of me between uploads, I do a weekly news and politics stream with my co-host Spoon over on the Broken Crown channel every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT. I also play a Pathfinder 1st Edition game on that same channel on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. GMT with single-player Carl and Kami Mark, as well as a Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition game over on Geeks and Gamers Tabletop at 5 p.m. GMT with Epic Mike, Comics Division, X-Ray Girl, and Disbrew, and DM'd by Erudai, if you're interested in something a little bit more nerdy from me. If you would like to support my work, you can sign up for my Patreon or Subscribestar to see your name at the end of every video along with these fine folks here. You'll also get access to my Discord, where we do watch parties of these videos before they go live. If you want something a little bit more tangible for your support, you can also check out my merch store, linked in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.
Yo, check the headlines, it's a digital war zone. GamerGate 1.0, where it all had grown. Talking ethics and gaming, it's a battleground. Five guys, burgers and fries pass solely around. Yeah, Queen say plus the start of the strife. The conspiracy theories fueling fire in the night. a Sarkeesian with a feminist frequency. Can't kiss their cringe cacophony. Adam Baldwin, Maloyana pull us in the mix. The chaos unfolding, this internet shit. More than pixels, an escape from the screens. GamerGate, what a dumpster of memes. All gamers, the most oppressed of all. In the shadows of the internet, we stand tall. GamerGate 2.0, we're ready to brawl. We'll rise up, never to fall. We are gamers, the most oppressed of all. In the shadows of the internet, we stand tall. GamerGate 2.0, we're ready to brawl. We'll rise up, never to fall. Now, fast forward 2.0, there's new battles to wage. Sweet Baby Incorporated on the stage. Funded by the DHS with a sinister plot. International governments calling the shots. Corporate journalists at Kotaku and IGN spreading lies and deceit. Dog, this never ends. They call us trolls, but we're fighting for our games. Steam curator list, yeah, let's fan the flames. We won't be silenced, we won't be ignored. Did it cause it was funny or because I was bored? So raise your controller and take a seat, cause at the end of the day, we're just a bunch of neats. We are gamers, the most oppressed of all. In the shadows of the internet, we stand tall. GamerGate 2.0, we're ready to brawl. We'll rise up, never to fall. Yeah, we rise, never fall. GamerGate, we stand tall. I mean, when we do stand, which isn't often, I'm basically glued to my gamer chair. That's not a metaphor, it's that sticky. GamerGate 2.0, yeah.